So welcome everyone to this FWR webinar, Working with Farmers for River Restoration. This webinar has been organised by the Foundation for Water Research, or FWR, which is an independent community of professionals from across the water sector and related scientific specialisms. The community comes together for deliberative discussion with the aim of developing interdisciplinary solutions to water challenges. You can stay up to date with the work of the FWR and topical issues in the water sector by signing up to our free newsletter, which I'll drop a link in the chat to as we get going. We are really pleased today to be joined by our speaker, Teresa Dent, CBE. Originally a farming consultant with Stratton Parker, Teresa was CEO of the Game and Wildlife Conservation Trust from 2011 to 2025 and still works there as a coordinator for area-based conservation projects, like the environmental farmers groups and farmer clusters that she'll be talking about today. Teresa was made a CBE for Services to Wildlife Conservation in 2015.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much for joining this webinar, and thank you very much for inviting me to speak. Next slide, please. So I'll just give a bit of background. Who and what is the Game and Wildlife Conservation Trust? We are an environmental NGO, very science-based. We employ about 2/3 of our staff are scientists involved in practical projects, and we see it as our role to try and find ways in which we can fit nature into a working farmed environment. So our mission is not nature reserves. We don't have nature reserves. Although they are wonderful things. Our mission is to help every farmer, every riparian owner, every moorland manager to make the land they manage a better place for nature. Historically, we've always had a strong connection with farmers and land managers. And as a research organisation, we started doing research into fisheries and river restoration back in the 90s, and since 2008 we've had a salmon and trout research centre on the River Frome in Dorset. My involvement has been as chief executive and in terms of collaborative working with farmers. Because my background was in farming, I've always been very interested in how we bridge the gap between the environmental world and the farming world. Next slide, please. So I want you to take you on a bit of a journey just to give you the background behind this farmer collaboration that is now leading to these river restoration projects with farmers. So farmer clusters is something that many of you may have heard of. They are groups of farmers working together fairly altruistically, generally contiguous farmers, to improve wildlife and nature on their farm. And they kicked off, you can track the story back to 2011, when government published an environment white paper and launched what were then called nature improvement areas. And I was asked to get a group of farmers together to do an NIA. So by the end of, actually not September 21, sorry, September 2011, two groups of farmers had entered the NIA competition, both of which I'd found. There were 72 entries and only 2 farmer groups. So all of the other entries were AONBs, national parks, environmental NGOs. One of them was accepted. I should have realised it would only be one farmer group because the other farmer group was led by a farmer who was married to my cousin, so I was in terrible trouble that they got rejected. But the Marlborough Downs Nature Improvement Area was launched. It was 38 farmers, over 10,000 hectares, and they very kindly asked me to chair it. That was the very first farmer collaboration on the environmental side. And it was a fascinating journey. We learned a lot. We learned about lapwing envy, the internal market, how to add value, how competitive the farmers were. They wanted to be the best NIA. We also learned a lot of the problems. These farmer groups lacked infrastructure. They weren't a legal entity. They didn't have a bank account. They had no paid staff, etc. However, NIAs were a one-off. the funding was not extended, which in many ways perhaps was a pity. Next slide, please. So one of the farmers I'd asked whether they wanted to do an NIA had said no. And that was somebody called Rob Shepherd. And he said, I would do something with my friends and neighbours. So when the NIA funding ended, I went back to Rob in April 2013 and said, why don't we try something with your friends and neighbours? And we had the first farmer cluster meeting in his dining room in April 2013. And by that summer, Natural England and DEFRA had agreed to pilot farmer clusters for a period of 18 months in 5 locations. And in April 2015, they launched the Facilitation Fund, which is still going. Next slide, please. Then in 2017, we launched the first super cluster, which was based around Martin Down in Dorset. That's the area of red in the middle of the map. And you can see that's surrounded by 3 separate farmer clusters. And the orange one on the east is Rob Shepherd's first Friends and Neighbours cluster. And again, this case of species envy came up. In this case, it was nightingale envy. Witnessed a very strong case of nightingale envy. Now, if you think about farmer clusters now, we don't know exactly how many there are in England, but we think between 100 and 150, probably covering between 10 and 15, between 1 million and 1.5 million hectares, mainly run by independent or FWR facilitators, some by GWCT, but only a few. And it is a real conservation movement. To be honest, if this had been set up by anything other than farmers who all like to keep their head below the parapet, this would be big news. Next slide, please. So the next chapter of this is the Environmental Farmers Group. Next slide, please. So environmental farmer groups, or EFGs, are farmer-led, farmer-owned, bottom-up environmental cooperatives, note the legal structure, operating at catchment scale. Their vision is to be a group of farmers protecting and enhancing nature for the public good. And their mission is to harness scale and member cooperation to secure the best environmental results and to achieve fair financial returns for those farmers for a wide range of natural capital goods and services. And the environmental objectives are to both meet and beat the government's Environmental Improvement Plan 2023 targets. And for the farmers, we split that into 3 areas: biodiversity and species recovery, cleaner water, and move towards net carbon zero farming by 2040. Our first one was in the Hampshire Avon catchment, which we launched in May 2020. And as I say, it came out of the farmer cluster movement, but this is bigger, more ambitious, has a proper business structure. And the idea is for the farmers to collectively access environmental trades and green finance. Next slide, please. We've now moved on. You can see in the bottom centre of that map, the Hampshire Avon catchment. And environmental farmers groups have expanded around the country to the Testanitchin to the east. We're now doing the Meon, Rother and Way further east, Dorset Stour to the west, Exmoor, Central England, North Lincolnshire, and there are similar groups in the uplands, in the Peak District, Swaledale and Wensleydale, and North York Moors. This slide says 687 farmers and moorland managers have either signed up or expressed interest, formally expressed interest. In fact, that's now over 700, and it's just over 400,000 hectares. So this is becoming quite a significant area in terms of the land actually owned and managed by the farmers. And if we think that these are operating at catchment scale, the area of land over which they seek to have an environmental influence is even more than that. Next slide, please. So how does this translate into river restoration? Next slide, please. Well, as you saw, cleaner water was part of the one of the three key environmental objectives. And I also referred to the Environmental Improvement Plan 2023 targets, and the water quality targets for farmers are to reduce nitrates, phosphates and sediment pollution from agriculture into water by 40% by 2038 using a baseline of 2018. So this is one of the key targets we are setting the farmers. Also, to restore 75% of our water bodies back to good ecological status, to protect our chalk streams, and to increase water storage. So these are all things which we feel the Environmental Farmer Group farmers can contribute to in the future. Next slide, please. One of the first water restoration projects we set up was on the Wylye, which is a tributary of the Hampshire Avon. And this was actually set up by one of the farmer clusters who joined the Hampshire Avon Environmental Farmers Group. So it's all the same farmers. And they've set up a 28-kilometre stretch of the Wylye where they are testing water quality, monitoring water quality on a weekly basis, and are also monitoring sedimentation. Next slide, please. I was going to show you an NFU film, which is a couple of minutes, but as the presentation wouldn't work off my computer, and it's now coming on off Ethany's computer, I'll get Ethany to send that round with a link later. Thank you. So in terms of Wylye water quality, I mean, to be honest, we've got all of the usual problems. Next slide, please. It is a beautiful chalk stream, but we've got sewage treatment works on it, and how good a job they're doing, I don't know, but the farmers often feel that they get more of the blame than they should. Whether that's fair or not, I don't know, but we don't have any data to prove it one way or the other at the moment, which is one of the reasons why they're so interested in monitoring their own water quality. Next slide, please. We have septic tanks. I have to admit, rather more septic tanks than I ever realised. Considering this is a chalk stream, one of the biggest villages, or I think most of the villages on the stream actually do not have sewage treatment works. They all have septic tanks, and I very much doubt whether many of them have been upgraded in recent decades. Next slide, please. Animal waste from farming is obviously another problem, although actually there is much, much less livestock farming on all of these chalkland farmed areas than there was 30 years ago, much less. Next slide, please. And sediment. Our fisheries team is very concerned about sedimentation and impact on spawning gravels. And this is a problem on the Wylye as well. And that's why the Farmer Water Quality Project is looking so carefully at sediment. Next slide, please. The way we're doing that is we're partnering with Rothamsted Research, and we are using their system of sediment source fingerprinting. Next slide, please. So the way that works is you put these sediment traps in the river. So you can see them installing them on the left-hand side picture, and on the right-hand side you can see it pegged to the river bottom. And they're effectively a drain pipe with a cone at one end, and a small amount of water enters into the pipe, slows down, the sediment settles out, And after 3 months, you take the pipe out of the river and you can analyse the sediment that's ended up in there. Next one, please. Now, to see where the sediment has come from, you need to have taken soil samples from all the spots in the catchment where soil might be moved from into the river. Now, this is a big job, and probably a bigger job than we realised, because you sometimes need to go quite a long way from the river. You might need to go way up a track and into a gateway, because in a rain event, if that field's inarable or it's just been ploughed, there might be a long way that soil is travelling. If it's travelling out into a road, into a drain, and that drain is linking to the river, then soil can move a long way from its starting point to get into the river. But I'm sure you all know that. Next slide, please. Soil samples taken out of the sediment pipe are dried in the laboratory. Next slide, please. And then they are analysed. Next slide, please. Against the soil samples that we've taken. And the soil samples are split into different areas. They're split into cropped area, grass area, and riverbank area. Next slide, please. So this is some of the results we're seeing after a year of doing the sediment tests. So we're analysing in this graph what the correlation between the soil in the sediment trap, which is the blue dots on, which are the blue dots on the graph, and the soil from the soil samples for cropland, which are the orange dots. And you can see on this graph there is not very much correlation. Next graph, please. Then we looked at the channel bank, and there is more overlap between the sediment pipe samples and the actual soil samples for that. Next slide, please. The most interesting one is this one, which is the grassland soil samples, which do overlap quite considerably with the sediment pipe soil samples. Now, this was a bit of a surprise, I have to say. I think the farmers probably thought that most of the soil runoff was coming from the arable fields. They certainly would have assumed that it was coming from the river bank. And they probably didn't expect it to be coming from the grassland. So this is both interesting and challenging. Interesting because it's counterintuitive, and challenging in a good way, because what it means is we need to take all the farmers out onto the grassland areas next to the river and start looking at them through new eyes. So where is that soil coming from? What is the pathway into the river, and what can we do to change management to prevent that happening in the future? Next slide, please. In terms of where else are farmers undertaking this type of work? Well, in the Hampshire Avon catchment, I've described what's happening on the Wylye. Similar work is happening on the Nadder, which is the next tributary south. Also on the Ebble, which is the next one down. There's some similar work happening on the lower Avon, sort of south of Ringwood. And also we've got farmers interested in starting all of this on the Bourne, which is one of the more northern tributaries. We're doing water quality testing, but not sediment work yet on the test, on a stretch of the test. And we're also starting whole river restoration projects with EFG farmers on the Test and Itchen, and also on the middle of the Froome and the Piddle, which is a tributary of the Froome. And then we're also looking at how farmers can work collaboratively for flood mitigation up in Swaledale and Wensleydale. Can we just see there's a next slide? No, so go back to the one before. So I've been, what can we learn from this? I've been very impressed with the farmers' willingness to embrace what they can do to improve water quality and contribute to river restoration. It's interesting for them to do their own testing and analysis because it puts them in a safe place to consider whether or not they are contributing to water quality issues or sedimentation and what they can do about it. Obviously, this is a coalition of the willing and a coalition up to a point of the enlightened. But that doesn't make it any less valid. And I think over time, other farmers who perhaps not yet part of EFG will come into this. The challenge they face is if they find problems, what do they do about it? And that's a whole next chapter, if you like, which I might be able to come and talk to you about in a year's time or something. But this is relatively new as a way of doing things. There are other projects around the country. There's been a very similar project on the River Wensum, which has been run by a very, very good farmer cluster facilitator, and they've learnt a lot too. But I think this is a very interesting and constructive way forward to work with farmers to help deliver the cleaner water and healthier rivers that we all want. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Teresa. I'll just stop sharing. That was so interesting to hear about the EFG groups and how they've working to support river restoration. And I'm really keen to now kind of spend some time on Q&A. So all of our attendees, please do put your questions for Teresa in the Q&A function. Just to kick us off, I mean, obviously you finished there by saying that in these cases it's kind of the coalition of the willing. But what do you think have been some of the key success factors to make these collaborations successful, and how have you dealt with any conflicts that have arisen throughout the country whilst they've been setting up?
I think what makes them successful, I mean, like everything in life, there's a whole sort of basket of things. First of all, the fact that farmer clusters and environmental farmer groups are bottom up. So this is farmers setting up as farmers. So the environmental farmers group has spread to over 700 farmers entirely through word of mouth between farmers. So farmers ring a farmer in the Test and Itchen did ring a farmer in the Avon and say, I hear you started a thing called the Environmental Farmers Group. Well, why can't we have one of those in the Test and Itchen? And similarly, somebody rang from Swaledale and Wensleydale to the Peak District. I hear you're doing something. Can we do something like that? So this feeling that they're slightly in charge of their own destiny is really important. Then to get them really good advice, but from people they've chosen rather than having posed on them. So one of the great successes of the Wiley one is that one of the farmers there has employed an ecologist himself. And that ecologist is available to all the farmers in the farmer cluster and the other tributaries, because they're all working together through EFG to help them get set up. And he's seen as their person, their ecologist, so they trust him. So bottom up, trusted advisors. And then I think the third thing is recognition that the farmers are genuinely trying to do something well, to improve the environment. They often feel very battered and labelled as the villains, the environmental villains, and they don't want to be in that place. And I think we need to perhaps recognise that for farming to be a net zero polluter is impossible. It's, it's a factory floor without a roof and without an enclosed drainage system. So to imagine that you're not going, there's a net zero pollution position for farming is not realistic. All we can hope and help them to do is to minimize it.
Thank you, Teresa. And I think you've hit on a really interesting point there. So actually in a recent FWR discussion, we were talking about enabling nature-based solutions at scale. And one of the points they talked about was the need for landowners and farmers to have opportunities for peer-to-peer learning. So as these environmental farmers groups have grown, have there been kind of opportunities for peer-to-peer training and kind of what's working and what's not working? And related to that, an attendee said that they were interested in your comment around it would be big news, except it's run by farmers who keep their heads down. And do you think this needs to change?
That's two questions. So peer-to-peer learning. Well, there's a lot of informal peer-to-peer learning within the environmental farmers group, because it's farmers on the Ebble talking to farmers on the Wiley, and in turn talking to farmers on the Nadder. So there's probably a lot going on there that I'm not even seeing, because that's all within farming. But then you've got people like Rothamsted coming in as trusted advisors, GWCT. We do most of the ecological advice for the EFG, so we're trusted advisors. We set up a series of webinars from our GWCT research and demonstration farm, the Allerton project, which are available to all EFG farmers. And I'm sure, this has only been going 3 years, but I'm sure in time there will be more scope to expand that peer-to-peer learning. And farmers, it's a cliche to say they learn from looking over the hedge or looking over the gate, but they certainly do quite like learning from each other, and they like learning in the field rather than in the classroom, if you see what I mean.
Yeah, that makes sense. And obviously you mentioned that these groups are working on the catchment level. Do they have much engagement with catchment-based partnerships? And do they also do they have any involvement from water companies who kind of collaborate with farmers on some of these shared challenges?
Yes and no. This is a difficult one. I have to be careful, because I don't want to give the impression that the farmers don't want to work with those sort of partnerships or water companies, because often that working together is very fruitful, and the Wessex Rivers Trust has been enormously helpful to farmers in the Wiley, and that again is a very good trusted relationship. But both the Avon and the Test and Itchen have a catchment partnership, and it is quite a difficult structure for farmers to engage with, if I'm honest. I think the catchment partnership in the Avon has something like 30 organisations. Everything from the Rivers Trust to the County Council to water companies, everybody, 30 organisations. So if a farmer goes to a catchment partnership meeting, they're probably the only farmer in the room. So that's quite intimidating. And then you tend to get the farmer who can afford to be there because they're retired, and the farmer who's farming can't afford to be there because he's not paid to be in that room, unlike everybody else, if you see what I mean. And I don't mean that rudely in any way, but he has to pay somebody else to run his farm that day while he goes to the meeting, essentially. And has EFG engaged as much as I would like in catchment partnerships? No, because if I'm honest, it's taken massive energy to get 700 farmers together nationally. And I haven't yet had the energy to say, okay, I've got 700 farmers together. Now we need to bring in the catchment partnership but we are beginning to do that. And on the test in Itchen, we are very grateful to Southern Water, who is providing funding for the Environmental Farmers Group to start developing a river restoration package between them. So we're very grateful to that. So please, I wouldn't like anybody in a catchment partnership or a water company who might be listening to think that the farmers would not like to engage. But there's an element of getting them together first, which takes a lot of time and effort, and then sort of shifting the focus into, right, now we're a group, who else can we usefully partner with to do this better?
That makes a lot of sense. Thank you, Teresa. Thanks. And you touched there a little bit on funding, mentioning that a water company, Southern Water in this case, had funded one of the EFGs. Is that the usual funding model, or is there different types of funding models? Is there kind of a typical cost of running an EFG, or is it very variable depending on the catchment?
There is no funding model, in a sense, from government, which is a great shame. I mean, in a way, environmental farmer groups have been a victim of their own success, because there is no DEFRA funding for something of this size. And all of the current grant schemes were conceived 4 to 5 years ago, before the Environmental Farmers Group was conceived. They might have been launched since. So landscape recovery, you would think, oh, obviously that's going to work for environmental farmer groups. But in fact, round one of landscape recovery was limited to 5,000 hectares. Well, the Avon catchment is 175,000 hectares. And round two, although that focused on rivers, and that Wiley Valley project that I showed you is actually funded through landscape recovery, that doesn't fund the one on the Nadder or the one on the Ebble. And actually, it funds about 650 hectares of land adjacent to the river. So we are struggling to get funding that achieves the scale that we would like to achieve, the farmers would like to achieve, and which actually we need to achieve to get a reversal of biodiversity loss. So we are trying to bring those discussions to government, but it's in some ways I wish there hadn't been an election, because it might have been easier to move this forward if we hadn't had the disruption of an election.
Thank you, Teresa. And I think really interesting to hear your kind of reflections on that, because again, when we've been talking about kind of delivering nature-based solutions on scale, you come across similar challenges related to the types of funding models available, how you kind of make it work on a landscape catchment regional level. And so it's interesting to think about how EFGs and nature-based solution delivery could kind of, go hand in hand. So thank you for that. One other question we've got here is around, have you observed any trends between things like farm size or duration of operation in terms of their willingness to engage with EFGs and river restoration?
I don't think I have, although I haven't done any analysis. I think for me, one of the real strengths of this farmer-led collaboration is that I think it transcends the sort of intergenerational stuff. So at one stage, government was talking quite a lot about the fact that they were renting environmental outcomes through agri-environment schemes. So for 2 years, 5 years, 10 years, and then the funding stopped, and possibly the field that had been converted from arable into a meadow was reverted back to arable. And there was this concern expressed about renting. I think what I've seen with my journey with farmer clusters and environmental farmer groups is that actually the commitment of the farmers to the environmental outcomes only increases as you go down. You see a generational change on the farm once they're in a farmer cluster or an EFG. And that's really positive. The first farmer cluster we did in one of the, I won't specify which one of the areas, there wasn't really very much interest in the river. But 10 years on from when we started the farmer cluster, for some of those farms, the next generation is coming in and they're intensely interested in the river. And also, we tend to forget how long these farmers have been there. I did a straw poll in a meeting of farmers in a test and itching meeting, and the average length of time that the 6 people had been on their farms was 92 years. So they do think long term, and I think this gives us long term commitment in a way that we've struggled to achieve before.
That's really interesting. Thank you. Changing focus a little bit, in your presentation, you talked about monitoring and the importance of monitoring in this work, and that farmers are actually doing their own monitoring often. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about kind of how they're trained in some of these areas and whether there's any kind of quality assurance or regulation of the results that they're getting from that testing and monitoring.
At the moment, training, yes. They've been trained by our fisheries scientists, by Rothamsted. Accreditation, no. Verification, no. Are those things that it would be good to do in the future? Yes, I'm sure. I mean, I run a science, or I used to be chief executive of a science organisation. I'm now just involved in these area-based conservation projects. So yes, I'm sure that would all be good. The difficulty we've got is there is not nearly enough monitoring happening full stop, let alone adequate funding for it. And if we start wanting verification as well, then that's an added expense. So we probably have to focus the limited resource there is available on the most productive element of it, which is probably the monitoring.
Great, thank you. And a comment here saying, many thanks, this sounds like wonderful work. Have you made any links to soil management on the farms and how improved soil management could yield significant improvements to water quality?
Absolutely. Yeah, this is the absolute crux of the sedimentation because it's coming off a field and the farmer does not want to lose his soil from his field. Regenerative farming has really focused farmers' attention on their soil quality and structure and how they manage it in a way that perhaps we haven't had that attention to detail with soil management for probably in my time in agriculture. So yes, all of that is intrinsically linked without doubt.
Great, thank you. And of course, in your presentation, you talked about how this is a kind of bottom-up organisation in terms of the EFGs. But are you aware of whether kind of big landowners, both corporate and private, are encouraging their tenants to join schemes like these?
So big private landowners, we're finding are generally encouraging because if a big private landowner still has tenants, they're pretty committed to that land use structure. And therefore, in this time of really quite turbulent transition and change, where we're moving to a whole new environmental market, they're generally very keen to try and make sure that their tenants can benefit from that as well. And whatever economic models going forward they have for their tenants, there is a system for sharing natural capital. For the big institutional landowners, I think, to be honest, they will probably want to create their own natural capital solutions, and they're less likely to be interested in the environmental farmers group model.
Okay, great, thank you. And final question. Thank you for answering so many of these. It's been great to hear a little bit more about the scheme. So obviously you talked about these EFGs aligning with the environmental improvement plan and kind of some key areas within that. And you focused on water quality for most of this presentation. But do you feel that there could be scope to extend the focus of this group to other environmental challenges, such as air quality impacts, as well as things like water quality?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, we are writing whole catchment plans for each catchment that EFG is in. And the whole catchment plan takes as its framework all of the environmental targets in government's Environmental Improvement Plan 2023, which includes everything from biodiversity, nature abundance, water quality, clean air, carbon. So yes, it is I perhaps didn't go into the catchment scale conservation plans very much because this was very focused on water. But yes, the conservation plan goes much wider than just water.
So interesting. Oh, well, a massive thank you to Teresa. It's been so interesting hearing about this scheme. And yeah, we do hope to hear more about it as you continue down the path. But it sounds like a really excellent program of work. So thank you for coming to talk to the FWR about it. And thank you to all our attendees for listening as well and adding all those questions. That's been really great. As usual, this webinar has been recorded and it will be made available on our YouTube channel and our website. And if you are watching the recording on YouTube, please do subscribe to our channel, like the video, and hit the bell to gain notifications of new content. And if you're not a member, please do consider joining the IES to support your professional development and our work. But this is all we have time for today. Again, a massive thank you to you, Teresa, and to everyone here. Have a great rest of your day. Thank you.
Thank you very much.